Dust doesn't settle in Bitter Creek. It just waits for the next wind. When the noon train hissed to a halt, it brought a woman who wasn't looking for a savior. She was looking for a roof. And the man waiting on the platform wasn't looking for a wife. The iron brakes of the Union Pacific locomotive screamed against the tracks, spitting sparks and hot steam over the wooden platform. Josephine stepped out of the passenger car and immediately tasted dirt. It coated the back of her throat, thick and metallic. She didn't cough. She simply adjusted the grip on her single leather valise and descended the iron steps. She wasn't a vision in lace, and she knew it. Her dress was heavy, dark brown wool, chosen not to hide dirt, but to survive it. The wind howled across the Dakota plains, tearing at the pins in her hair, trying to unravel her before she even set foot in her new life. Josephine let it try. She had survived worse than wind back in Philadelphia. The platform was nearly empty, save for a station master hauling a burlap sack and a man standing beside a weather-beaten buckboard wagon. He was tall, built like the axle of a cart, all hard lines and unyielding iron. His coat was canvas, stained with grease and age, and the brim of his Stetson was pulled low against the glare of the midday sun. In one gloved hand, he held a crumpled piece of paper. Her letter. Josephine walked straight toward him. She didn't wait for him to approach. She didn't lower her eyes. "You're Wilson Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and entirely devoid of warmth. He looked at her the way a man assesses a horse he's about to buy, checking for lame legs and bad temper. "I am," he said. His voice was gravel and dry timber. He glanced down at the paper, then back at her. "You don't look like your picture." "The picture is 10 years old and cost me 50 cents. I wasn't going to pay for another." She set her valise down. "Are we going to stand here debating photography, Mr. Mercer? Or are you going to show me the house I agreed to keep?" Wilson blinked. A faint, nearly imperceptible shift occurred in his jaw. A lesser man might have laughed. Wilson just nodded. He reached down, grabbed her valise with one hand, and tossed it into the back of the wagon. It hit the wooden bed with a hollow thud. "Climb up," he said. The ride to the ranch took 3 hours. They didn't speak. Josephine sat rigidly on the splintering wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, watching the town of Bitter Creek disappear into a sea of yellow grass and sagebrush. The landscape was brutal. There were no trees to break the horizon, only rolling hills of dead earth and an endless, crushing sky. It was a place designed to make a human being feel entirely insignificant. Josephine found it incredibly comforting. Out here, no one cared who you used to be. When the wagon finally crested a ridge, Wilson pulled back on the reins. "Whoa!" He pointed with a thick, leather-clad finger. "There!" Josephine looked. Nestled in a shallow dip in the land was a structure that barely qualified as a house. It was a sod and timber cabin, its roof patched with tin and tar paper. A dilapidated barn leaned heavily to the right 50 yards away, and a wire fence stretched out into the nothingness, holding in a scattered herd of skeletal cattle. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a desperate argument against nature. "I told you in the letters," Wilson said, his voice flat, staring straight ahead. "It ain't a parlor. It's a working claim. I need someone to cook, mend, and keep the fire from going out while I'm pushing steers. I don't need a delicate flower." "Good," Josephine said, her voice equally flat. "Because I didn't travel 1,000 miles to arrange flowers. I came for a legal claim to a roof and a share of what we build. Let's go." Wilson flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward. Inside, the cabin was exactly as she expected. It smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and loneliness. A layer of pale dust coated the cast-iron stove. The floorboards were swept, but rough and stained. There was one bed in the corner, covered in a heavy, scratchy quilt, and a small cot shoved against the opposite wall. Wilson dropped her bag by the cot. "I sleep in the bed. My back is ruined from a horse fall 3 years ago. You take the cot." "Fine. I wake up at 4. I expect coffee, black and biscuits ready by 4:30. 4:30, she repeated, untying her bonnet. "And when do you wash your hands?" Wilson stopped halfway to the door. He turned around, his brow furrowed. "What?" Josephine pointed to a tin basin on a washstand that looked like it hadn't seen soap since the Civil War. "I am not your mother, Mr. Mercer. I am your business partner in this marriage. I will cook your meals, and I will mend your shirts. But I will not serve food to a man who sits at my table with manure on his knuckles. You wash before you eat, or you don't eat." Silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute. The wind rattled the tin roof. Wilson stared at her, his jaw clenching. He was a man who had lived alone for 5 years, answering to no one, doing exactly as he pleased in the squalor of his own making. He looked at this strange, hard-eyed woman standing in the middle of his dirt-floor kitchen, waiting for her to break. She didn't. Wilson gave a short, sharp exhale through his nose. He walked over to the basin, grabbed the cracked pitcher, and poured water into the bowl. He picked up a gray lump of lye soap. 4:30, he muttered, scrubbing his hands. 4:30, Josephine agreed, opening her valise. The first 3 weeks were a silent, grueling war of attrition. They were married by a circuit judge in town on a Tuesday. The ceremony took exactly 4 minutes. Wilson wore a clean shirt. Josephine wore her brown wool dress. When the judge told Wilson he could kiss the bride, Wilson looked at Josephine. Josephine looked at the door, and they walked out to the wagon without touching. Back at the ranch, they settled into a rhythm that was functional, but jagged. Wilson was a machine. He left in the dark and returned in the dark, smelling of sweat and cattle, his body moving with the stiff, mechanical rhythm of a man running purely on obligation. Josephine matched him step for step. She attacked the cabin with a ferocity that bordered on violence. She boiled the floorboards with lye. She took apart the cast-iron stove, scrubbed the soot from the flues, and reassembled it, so it no longer choked the room with smoke. She baked bread that was dense and heavy, but filling. She didn't sing while she worked. She didn't attempt to make small talk over dinner. She served the food, ate her portion in silence, and retired to her cot. She was exactly the laborer he had asked for, and it was driving him insane. Wilson found himself lingering by the barn, watching her through the cracked window as she aggressively kneaded dough. He had expected a woman who would weep at the isolation. He had expected someone who would beg to go back east, or at least someone who would try to soften him with forced smiles and domestic platitudes. Josephine did none of that. She operated with a cold, terrifying efficiency. She was a ghost who baked bread. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday over a stack of paper. Wilson came in from a driving rainstorm, soaked to the bone, expecting a hot meal. Instead, he found the kitchen table covered in his private ledger books. The binding was broken, receipts spilling out like dead leaves. Josephine was sitting in his chair, holding a fountain pen, crossing out lines of his handwriting with aggressive strokes of black ink. "What in the hell are you doing?" Wilson demanded, water pooling at his boots. Josephine didn't look up. "I'm saving you from bankruptcy. Take off your boots before you ruin the floor I just scrubbed." Wilson stormed forward, slamming his hand down on the table. The inkwell jumped. "Those are my books. You don't touch my books." She finally looked up, her expression completely devoid of intimidation. "Your books are a tragedy, Mr. Mercer. You're paying 12 cents a pound for feed from Miller's Mercantile, on credit, at a 20% interest rate. If you bought in bulk from the rail yard in Cheyenne, you'd pay 8 cents, and we wouldn't lose the east pasture to the bank by November." "I manage the money," Wilson snarled, his face inches from hers. "You manage the house." "This house sits on land that you are mismanaging," she shot back, standing up. She wasn't tall, but in that moment she took up all the oxygen in the room. "I signed a paper that made me your wife. That means your debts are my debts. If you freeze to death because the bank forecloses, I freeze with you. And I refuse to freeze because of a man's stubborn pride. I have kept this ranch alive for 5 years. "Move, barely," she yelled, her voice finally breaking its calm facade. "You are bleeding out, Wilson, and you're too damn proud to let someone tie a tourniquet." He froze. It was the first time she had used his first name. Wilson stared at her, his chest heaving under his wet coat. He wanted to throw her out. He wanted to yell. But he looked down at the ledger. He knew she was right. The bank had sent 2 warning letters already. He had hidden them under the mattress. Slowly, he stepped back. He reached down and pulled off his left boot, then his right. He walked to the stove in his wet stocking feet, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stood with his back to her. "Cheyenne is a 2-day ride," he said quietly to the stove. "We don't have the wagon space to haul bulk feed. Then we hire a freight driver. It still calculates to 10 cents a pound total. 2 cents saved." Wilson took a sip of the bitter coffee. "Fine. Fix the damn books." He didn't thank her. He didn't apologize. But that night he left an extra blanket at the foot of her cot before he went to sleep. The real shift, however, didn't happen over a ledger. It happened in the dark. It was a week later. Wilson was 5 miles out, camped near the ridge to keep watch over a group of pregnant heifers. Josephine was alone at the cabin. The night was pitch black, a new moon hiding behind thick, suffocating clouds. She was woken by a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a frantic, high-pitched squawking coming from the chicken coop behind the barn, followed by the heavy thud of wood splintering. Josephine sat up, the cold air biting through her thin nightgown. She didn't hesitate. She threw off the covers, shoved her bare feet into her leather boots, and walked to the corner of the room. Wilson's Winchester lever-action rifle was leaning against the wall. She checked the chamber in the dark. Loaded. She stepped out the back door into the biting wind. The noise from the coop was deafening now, a frenzy of dying birds and a low, guttural growling. Josephine raised the rifle, pressing the cold stock against her shoulder. She walked silently through the mud, rounding the corner of the barn. A shadow moved in the dark. It was massive, far too big for a coyote. A timber wolf, desperate and starving, had torn through the wire mesh. It had a hen in its jaws, blood matting its gray fur. The wolf snapped its head toward her. Its yellow eyes caught the faint light from the cabin window. It dropped the bird and turned, lowering its head, letting out a snarl that vibrated in Josephine's chest. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. Back east she had faced men with similar eyes, men who wanted to tear her apart just for existing. A wolf was simpler. A wolf was just hungry. The animal lunged. Josephine exhaled, tracked the shadow, and pulled the trigger. The roar of the Winchester shattered the night. The recoil punched her shoulder, hard enough to bruise bone. The flash of the muzzle illuminated the yard for a split second, showing the wolf snapping backward mid-leap. It hit the dirt with a heavy, wet thud, twitched once, and was still. Josephine lowered the rifle. Her ears were ringing. The surviving chickens were panicked, throwing themselves against the walls of the coop. She stood there for a long time, the cold wind whipping her nightgown around her legs, staring at the dead predator. When Wilson rode into the yard just after dawn, exhausted and frozen, he stopped his horse dead in its tracks. The wolf was laid out by the chopping block. It was a massive beast, over 100 pounds. He slid off his horse and walked slowly toward the cabin. He pushed the door open. Josephine was standing at the stove. She was wearing her brown wool dress. Her hair was neatly pinned. She was frying bacon. Her right shoulder moved a little stiffly, but otherwise, she looked exactly as she did every morning. Wilson looked at her, then looked out the window at the carcass in the yard. "You killed a timber wolf," he said, his voice flat with shock. "It was in the coop," she said, flipping a piece of bacon with a fork. "It killed 3 hens. I'll pluck them today. We'll have a stew. With my rifle. Unless you'd rather I politely asked it to leave." Wilson took off his Stetson. He didn't walk to the wash basin. He walked slowly across the kitchen, stopping just a few feet from her. He looked at her hands, strong and steady, holding the iron skillet. He looked at the tense set of her jaw. "Who were you, Josephine?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Before you got on that train." She stopped flipping the bacon. She didn't look at him. She stared at the popping grease. "I was a woman who didn't know how to shoot a wolf," she said quietly. "Now sit down. Your coffee is getting cold." Wilson didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly he turned, walked to the washstand, and began to scrub the dirt from his hands. Winter didn't arrive in Bitter Creek. It slammed into it like a runaway locomotive. By late November, the yellow grass was buried beneath 3 feet of snow. The wind no longer howled. It shrieked. The cold was a physical weight pressing against the thin tin roof, searching for a crack in the sod walls to slip its icy fingers through. Inside, the cabin became a tiny, suffocating universe of burning wood, boiling beans, and survival. They moved around each other in the cramped space, a silent, synchronized dance to avoid touching. Wilson chopped the wood. Josephine kept the stove fed. It was an existence whittled down to the bone. Then came the blizzard of January. It started mid-morning, a wall of white that swallowed the barn and erased the horizon. Wilson had gone out at dawn to drag 3 pregnant heifers into the shelter of the leaning timber shed. By noon, the temperature plummeted to 20 below. By 2 in the afternoon, Josephine could no longer see the fence line 10 yards from the window. She paced. She fed the fire until the iron belly of the stove glowed a dull, angry orange. She boiled water. And she waited. At 3 o'clock, the heavy oak door shuddered. Josephine yanked the deadbolt back. The wind blasted into the room, bringing a cloud of snow and Wilson. He fell across the threshold, a massive, snow-covered heap of canvas and wool, the door slamming shut behind him with a violent crack. He didn't get up. Josephine dropped to her knees. "Wilson!" He was violently shivering, his lips a terrifying, bruised blue. Frost and ice caked his beard and eyebrows. He mumbled something incoherent, his gloved hands clawing weakly at the floorboards. She didn't freeze. Panic was a luxury for people who had someone else to save them. Josephine grabbed him under the arms. He outweighed her by 80 pounds of dead, frozen muscle. She planted her boots against the door frame, gritted her teeth, and dragged him across the rough floor toward the stove. "Get up," she ordered, slapping his face. His skin was frighteningly cold. "Wilson, wake up!" His eyelids fluttered. "Calves. Got 'em in." "I don't care about the damn calves," she hissed, tearing at his heavy canvas coat. His fingers were stiff, useless. She unbuttoned his jacket, wrestling it off his shoulders, then went to work on his frozen boots. He was in the early stages of hypothermia. The ambient heat of the stove wouldn't be enough. He was dying on her kitchen floor. Josephine dragged him onto the heavy rug directly beside the iron stove. She ran to the bed, stripped the heavy wool blankets, and threw them over him. It wasn't enough. The shivering was slowing down, the final lethal surrender of a freezing body. She stared at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then, her jaw set, she unbuttoned her wool dress. She stripped down to her cotton shift, her breath pluming in the drafty edges of the room. She slid under the heavy mound of blankets, pressing her body against his freezing back. He flinched at the contact. "Hold still," she commanded, wrapping her arms around his chest, burying her face into the icy, damp wool of his shirt. She became the furnace. For hours she lay there on the hard, punishing floorboards, feeding him her own body heat. Outside, the blizzard screamed, threatening to tear the roof off and bury them both. Inside, there was only the erratic, shallow rasp of his breathing and the steady thumping of her own heart. Somewhere around midnight, the violent shivering stopped. Wilson let out a long, rattling sigh. His skin began to radiate a faint, fragile warmth. Josephine didn't move away. She was exhausted, her muscles cramped and aching, but she kept her arms tightly banded around his chest. "Josephine," he whispered into the dark. His voice was raw, scraped hollow by the wind. "I'm here." "Why did you come?" he asked. It wasn't an interrogation. It was a surrender. She watched the orange light from the stove grate flicker against the log wall. She thought about lying. She thought about telling him she wanted an adventure or a family. "I worked in a commercial laundry in Southwark," she said, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. 14 hours a day, steam and lie. It rotted your lungs. The girls who didn't cough up blood usually ended up marrying the drunkards who beat them just to make rent. I saved $3 over 2 years to buy a train ticket to anywhere else. Your advertisement asked for a worker. I knew how to work. Wilson was quiet for a long time. He shifted slightly, turning his head just enough so his cheek rested against her arm. "You're not a worker, Josephine," he muttered, his eyes closing as sleep finally overtook the cold. "You're the spine of this place." She stared at the wall until dawn, listening to him breathe. Spring in Dakota was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent, muddy resurrection. The snow melted in massive sheets, turning the prairie into a treacherous swamp of thick, sucking clay. But beneath the mud, the grass was green. The 3 heifers Wilson had nearly died for gave birth to 3 healthy calves. The air smelled of wet earth and survival. They hadn't spoken of the night on the floor. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a weapon. It was a shared language. Wilson no longer left his muddy boots by the door. He washed his hands before she asked. Josephine no longer baked the dense, joyless bread. She started adding wild honey she traded from a passing Shoshone hunting party. In late May, they drove the cattle to the railhead in Bitter Creek. It was a grueling 3-day push. Josephine rode flank, a kerchief tied over her nose, the Winchester resting in the scabbard of her saddle. She ate dust and slept on the hard ground. When they finally pushed the herd into the holding pens by the tracks, She was covered in a layer of grime that made her brown dress look gray. Wilson met with the cattle buyer while Josephine walked to the bank. Mr. Higgins, a fat man with a nervous sweat and a tailored suit, sat behind his mahogany desk. He looked at Josephine's dusty dress and calloused hands with thinly veiled contempt. "Mrs. Mercer," Higgins sighed, shuffling a stack of papers, "your husband's debt is substantial. A partial payment will only delay the inevitable foreclosure." Josephine didn't sit in the chair offered. She stood over his desk. She reached into her canvas satchel and pulled out Wilson's ledger alongside a thick roll of greenbacks banded in twine. She dropped the money onto the mahogany. It hit with a heavy, satisfying thud. "That is the principal," Josephine said, her voice like a steel wire. $340, calculated against the adjusted interest rate Wilson negotiated before the drought, not the inflated predatory rate you applied in November. Higgins blinked, his face turning the color of an overripe plum. "Now see here, little lady. Banking is a complex matter." The bank door opened. Wilson walked in. He smelled of cattle sweat and trail dust. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, coming to stand directly behind Josephine. He placed one heavy, calloused hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her in public. The weight of his hand was electric. "My wife does the math, Higgins," Wilson said quietly. His pale eyes locked onto the banker. "And my wife says the debt is settled. Count the money and give her the deed." Higgins looked at Wilson. He looked at Josephine's unblinking stare. He swallowed hard, picked up the money, and began to count. They rode back to the ranch as the sun began to dip behind the western ridge, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. They rode side by side. When they reached the cabin, the evening air was cool. Wilson unhitched the horses while Josephine went inside to light the lamps. She lit a match, touching it to the wick, watching the warm yellow glow spill across the kitchen. The floor was clean. The stove was black and polished. It was still a shack in the middle of nowhere, but it was theirs. She heard Wilson's heavy boots on the porch. The door opened. He didn't walk to the wash basin. He walked straight past the table, past the stove, and stopped in front of the small, narrow cot in the corner of the room. He reached down and picked up Josephine's leather valise. He carried it across the room and set it down gently at the foot of the large, heavy bed. Josephine stood perfectly still, the burnt match smoking in her fingers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, sudden rhythm. Wilson turned around. He took off his Stetson and hung it on the peg by the door. He looked at her. The harsh, unyielding lines of his face had softened. The winter had stripped them both down to the studs, burning away the pride and the fear, leaving only the truth underneath. "You've been sleeping on that cot for 7 months, Wilson said, his gravel voice thick with something entirely new. "It's bad for the spine." "You said your back was ruined," Josephine replied, her voice barely a whisper, holding his gaze. Wilson took a step toward her, then another. He stopped inches away. He reached out, his thick, scarred fingers gently touching the side of her face. His thumb brushed a streak of trail dust from her cheekbone. "My back is fine, Josephine," he murmured. He didn't ask. He simply leaned down, closing the distance. His lips met hers, rough, hesitant at first, then desperate, a collision of two people who had forgotten what it meant to be held. Josephine dropped the match. She grabbed the lapels of his canvas coat, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in 1,000 miles of empty prairie. Outside, the Dakota wind began to blow across the dark plains, howling against the tin roof. But inside, the fire was burning bright, and they were finally warm. The West wasn't won by heroes. It was built by the stubborn. Wilson and Josephine didn't find a fairy tale in the dust, but they forged something unbreakable out of the dirt and the cold. Their story proves that sometimes the hardest terrain to conquer is the space between two people. If this gritty, grounded romance struck a chord with you, please drop a like, share this video with fellow story lovers, and subscribe for more untamed Western tales.